paid good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off. Turn it off.
It's the year 2033. There's no law. No mercy.
You're gonna really love this one. Bang.
And no water.
There are 3 million liters of water underneath the blue dunes, and you will retrieve it.
The odds of survival are 1,000 to 1. And that's just the way she likes it.
My. Talented, isn't she?
Hi! Feeling a little inadequate?
She'll be fun to break.
I like pain.
Lori Petty.
Did I hurt you yet?
Ice-T.
Turn this boat around and you're gonna get us all killed.
And Malcolm McDowell.
Just how many of my men did you kill?
United Artists Pictures presents.
Just say, I won.
I won.
Tank Girl.
What's it like knowing you're about to die?
You don't think!
Welcome to the Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me once again is Ms. Rahne Alexander.
Hey.
Also back in the booth is Ms. Dahlia Schweitzer.
So excited to be here and talking about this movie.
We continue our grab bag march with a look at Rachel Talalay's Tank Girl. Released in 1995, the film stars Lori Petty as the titular Tank Girl, also known as Rebecca. She is a living cartoon character trapped in a desert wasteland off Australia, where she fights against the Water and Power Corporation run by the wicked Keesley, played by Malcolm McDowell. She's joined in her struggle by Naomi Watts as Jet Girl and a host of mutant kangaroos, which include Ice-T and Jeff Kober. The film was almost universally derided when it came out. Was it studio interference? Wrong place, wrong time? Just a bad idea? We hope to answer all those questions as we go ahead. So if you don't want anything ruined, please turn off the podcast and come on back after you've seen the movie. It's now easier than ever to see it. And I think there's a new Umbrella Blu-ray that's coming out pretty soon too. So yeah, go pick it up. We will still be here. So Dahlia, when was the first time that you saw Tank Girl and what did you think?
I knew you were going to ask me that question. And there are actually very few movies that I can remember vividly the experience of seeing them for the first time. Ghostbusters was the first movie I ever saw in theaters. So I remember walking into the theater, but I don't remember anything about the movie. I saw Barbed Wire in theaters because I was so excited for that movie that I remember I went with my college boyfriend and the theater was of course totally empty. It was just the two of us, but it was a real pivotal moment for me. But most movies I can't remember. It's kind of like there was a before Tank Girl and there was an after Tank Girl. And I remember, high school Dahlia hadn't seen it. I know that. But college Dahlia, and I graduated high school in 94. College Dahlia had seen Tank Girl, so I saw it in college, but I don't remember if I saw it in theaters. Probably, because I feel like DVDs weren't as common, but I cannot for the life of me remember where I first saw it. It's just, I remember having seen it. I wanted to pull out, I don't know if there's a place for you to share this online for your fans, but Tank Girl was such a pivotal inspiration. First of all, I owned the soundtrack that I absolutely have on CD. And then I was in a band in my early 20s in New York, and many of my looks, you can even see the socks there. Many of my looks were very Tank Girl inspired. I remember at the time being convinced that she was gay, which I think, many people were. And then when I discovered she wasn't gay, it was a real disappointment.
And how about you, Rahne?
Well, yeah, I was very disappointed about that. And if there's one thing I've learned from Tank Girl, it's that heteronormativity seems to survive like cockroaches. Nothing will probably kill it, maybe, unfortunately. I saw Tank Girl opening weekend and many times after that. This is basically my Star Wars. Yeah, there was a theater in Santa Cruz where I was living at the time where they wouldn't clear the theater between screenings. And so even though I went in to see it like 3 or 4 times, maybe that first weekend, I think I only paid once. So I'm realizing now that I contributed to the box office tanking of Tank Girl.
It's all your fault. It's all your fault.
Sorry. I'm so sorry. I was poor and in my 20s.
To be fair, I was reading that Tommy Boy came out the same weekend as Tank Girl. And because Tank Girl was cursed with an R rating, a lot of people bought tickets for Tommy Boy, but then walked into Tank Girl. That might also have been partly to blame.
I don't know how much I believe that. It's a good theory. I don't know if I buy it.
It probably counts for like 50 tickets.
I also saw this theatrically when it first came out. I can't say I enjoyed it nearly as much as you two. Lori Petty has always just kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and her performance in this, I mean, I think it's kind of perfect for the movie, but it took a lot for me to be able to handle it just because she is, like I said, she's a living cartoon character in this. She is basically Bugs Bunny putting a cigar in Malcolm McDowell's mouth, lighting it and letting it explode in his face. Like, this is a living cartoon, which once I finally grew to accept that, I was like, okay, that makes it a little bit better. But then the movie just doesn't hold together for me, and especially the end. And I feel terrible because the filmmaker herself is just like, oh yeah, we didn't have an ending. Like they made us change all this stuff. And there is an ending in the deleted scenes, which I found interesting, but it's not an ending.
To be clear, what you're saying is it didn't influence the way that you dress.
No, it didn't influence the way that I dress. No. Except that I suddenly had a thing for kangaroos afterwards. So
who didn't?
Oh, well, I don't know. Should we be grateful that the prosthetic penis didn't make it into the movie?
Kind of wanted to see it, though.
I know.
$5,000. They spent $5,000 on a prosthetic penis that we never get to see.
I did not know that was a thing until I was reading up for the recording. And I was like, oh my God, what a different movie we could have had.
See, this is why this is my Star Wars. I want the director's cut. I could give a fuck about any other big tentpole film, all the series. I would trade in all the Lords of the Rings, all the Star Warses, all the Star Treks for a director's cut of Tank Girl.
I will not say no to that because I think every movie deserves to come out in the way that the filmmakers wanted the movie to come out, and that the filmmaker was not happy with the way that this came out. It makes me super sad. And you can see there's like glimmers of stuff. And it's like reading the script, I was like, all right, well, this kind of all holds together. And it actually made things work a little bit more for me. There's some interesting choices here. Like this whole like introduction of Tank Girl's, I guess it's her boyfriend, Richard, at the house that they're living at, this kind of like haven for freaks and misfits and just all of these people that society doesn't want. And they're all banded together like a bunch of kangaroos and they're hanging out. But like to introduce Richard in that kind of like fake out way, I was just like, well, that's kind of odd. And then when we have Sam, the little girl, interacting with Tank Girl, she's also faking and like pretends that she's dead. And I was just like, this is a weird way to introduce these characters with all of these fake outs and stuff. I wish that there had been a little bit more of that house at the beginning and just a little bit more of that relationship between her and Richard. And there's another guy that's also there that's kind of busting her chops as far as like, hey, you need to cook dinner tonight. It's your turn. You're kind of a slacker. And then way later in the screenplay, when the Rippers are talking about like how they're going to do things, and they're like, oh, we should all eat first. And she actually volunteers to make dinner. And I was like, well, that's really nice. It's like she's growing, and I don't think that's like an anti-feminist thing that she's making dinner. It's like her responsibility. She's like, well, I can do this. Like, cause she totally skips out on all responsibility when she's at that house at the beginning. And there's even that you get a little bit of flavor of that. And I think that it must have been shot because you get Sam wanting that, for lack of a better term, phantasm ball. And she's like, I'll trade you food for that phantasm ball. What do they call it? Like a death ball or whatever it is. Like, and so it's like, oh, okay. So, and that's because Rebecca didn't eat. She didn't make dinner. They wouldn't let her eat because that was her responsibility. So I was like, oh, okay. So there are like pieces of this that were missing. So to your point, Rahne, I wish that there was the director's cut of this. I wish that there was a full restoration and we just had all of these pieces put all back together. I would have loved to have seen what the original vision of this was.
One thing that I thought was really peculiar, because I was reading all these different articles about the movie prior to this recording session. I don't know if you guys noticed this. Some of the articles talked about how closely involved the creators of the comic had been and how happy they were with the result. And then other articles talk about how they were barely involved and they hated it. I don't know. It's like the strangest thing and it's like one article will be like, oh, they were totally on board and they were involved with the production design and the script and the this and the that. And then the other one is like, oh, they just sold it and then they hated everything that came after. And I thought that was really peculiar. And it just made me wonder, where does the truth lie? And I remember when I was researching Office Killer, I was obviously very closely looking for mentions of Office Killer and stuff written about Cindy Sherman. And there was this one book that talked about how Cindy Sherman had like distanced herself from the movie and was so unhappy with it that she wanted nothing to do with it. Which, again, I don't want to say the author was lying. Maybe the author just had incorrect information. But I know for a fact, because I did so much research for my book on Office Killer, that is completely not true. And that Cindy had been involved in everything and was very proud of it. So I don't know. I'm like, what is the truth? Were they happy? Were they unhappy? Were they involved? Were they not involved? I mean, it's very possible that, like with the director, they weren't happy with the end result. But there was just such a discrepancy in all these different articles about, I don't know, did you guys, maybe you read more than I did about the comic creators?
Well, last night before this, I watched the film with commentary by Rachel Talalay and Lori Petty talking. And so this was about 10 years ago, was what I was gathering from the commentary. So they're still looking at the film 20 years on. And I mean, they're speaking about working so closely with the comic creators and talking about the aesthetic and the costume design, the production design, all of which is so fantastic and so perfect. As Rachel in particular is talking about the film, she's talking about certain scenes where she feels really, really pained. She's like, here's this sequence here, and I find it really, really, really painful. And at first she says, I'm not going to talk about it. And then she talks a little bit more about it. And I would imagine that there would be some similarities between the labor of love that this is for Rachel Talalay and Cindy Sherman's Office Killer. As an artist, there's so many of my projects where I look at a thing and it pains me that it doesn't work quite the way that I want it to, but it's out there now still. And, usually I keep those little pains to myself, but I can definitely understand the impulse to, like, even in a moment to say, like, oh, I don't want anything to do with this, which I could see others misreading as, she really wants to distance herself from that. I think it probably depends on what the source is and who you're talking to. And I could definitely see that the creators of the comic would eventually say, like, it wasn't the success that I wanted to be for any number of reasons. But I find this film such a miracle that it even exists. It only exists because of love and drive and passion, and from a director who really saw her chance to, like, do something big, coming off of the Nightmare on Elm Street sequel. She's like, all right, I'm really going to try to make something really, really ambitious. And you know what? If it only gets 50 or 60% of the way there of the original vision, especially for me as that audience member on opening day, it was such a thrill ride. And it feels, even though I can tell that it's a flawed film, it's still perfect to me.
I mean, you can count the female-led sort of, I don't know if you want to call her, I guess she's like a superhero, but, sort of female-led action movies. I don't know if you want to, because however you want to describe it. But basically, it's like we go from this to Catwoman, which of course was also like kind of universally panned. There's also just something about the concept of the movie itself that is destined to fail. It's almost like it doesn't even matter who was behind the camera, who was making the movie, that just because of the content itself, the odds were against it.
I really hate things like how Madam Web is out, and from all I've read, it's a terrible movie and it's not going to make back its money. And people are inevitably going to say, well, it's because it was a female-led movie. And it's like, well, Morbius was a male-led movie, and that was just as bad, if not worse. So you can't just paint it that it's a female-led movie. Stop it. Because it's not fair. And yeah, I think that this really goes to capture the anarchy of the original comic, because the comic moves all over the place, and you can start a story on one page and 3 pages later, you're in a completely different place. They capture a lot of that anarchy here. I think that the set design and production design is terrific.
And the costumes.
Oh, the costumes are wonderful. Everything looks so good. And talking about those rippers, the special effects for the kangaroos looks terrific. Way better than it has any right to look.
And it still looks good.
Oh, it
30
does.
years later, it still looks good.
I wish the rippers had been done a little bit differently. And maybe I'm alone with that. Other than that, I agree that I think the movie looks gorgeous. What
about them would you have done differently?
The movie has just so many things stacked against it. I mean, I think the R rating was a huge problem because, that movie should have been PG-13. I don't understand why it got an R rating. It doesn't make any sense. But I feel like the Rippers look a little bit like they were designed for children. And I would have liked them, especially considering, what it is that they do. I would have liked them to look a little bit more, less like kind of like snuggly stuffed animals, and maybe a little bit more sort of dangerous, even a little bit more sexy, which then I think would have made the romance feel a little bit more plausible, just edgier. Like they just felt like they'd escaped from, like a Muppets movie or something.
That's one of the things that I love about it. That's
why I'm saying I might be alone with it.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, I'm not a comics reader. I'm a very sporadic comics reader. So as much as I love this film, it didn't send me back to collecting every issue of Tank Girl and reading the lore, Maybe I'm a fair weather Tank Girl fan in that regard. So I can't really speak to what I would have imagined the Rippers to be if I had delved in there. But the picture that is being painted of them culturally before we meet them is that they are terrifying. And how many things are actually not that terrifying once you actually get to know them, right? That seems honestly that feels like one of the most authentic things about this film. These are just goofy reincarnated mutant guys as kangaroos.
I wanted them sexier.
I mean, maybe if we had seen that $5,000 cock, maybe we'd be seeing.
I know. That's why I wonder, what are we missing out on? But again, I think that's why the movie is in this really weird place where parts of it, whatever it was, I don't even know what made them give it an R rating, but whatever adult content is in there that, would skew toward people over 18. But then so much of the movie, I feel like it's PG-13 and would have been loved probably by 13, 14, 15-year-old kids.
For sure. I think that it has so much to do with complete female autonomy, bodily autonomy, which is being represented by Tank Girl responding to being bound and saying, it's really hard for me to play with myself in this thing, right? There's nothing R-rated about it unless this is an idea that sends you off into tizzy land, right? Oh my God, not only would you masturbate, but you would do it under those conditions.
I just looked up, some PG-13 movies. And yeah, it's Guardians of the Galaxy, The Dark Knight Rises, Black Panther. Those are all PG-13 movies. Why wasn't Tank Girl PG-13?
It might be now, because I think it should have been back in 95, because there's very few swear words. I'm trying to think if you see...
No nudity.
Yeah.
Right? No nudity.
I think nothing. The only boobs you see are in the club. What was that? Liquid
Silver.
Liquid Silver. When she's getting dressed up in those outfits, the stage dressing is like 3 or 4 women in the back, and you can see their breasts, but they're probably fake breasts. They're probably fake women as well. I don't think that they're cutouts with real breasts coming through at all. It doesn't make any sense that that would be the case.
I don't even remember that moment.
Oh,
so
it's way in the background. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so weird.
As far as what stories to believe, what stories to not believe, I mean, it is interesting because there's the whole thing of like, well, it was, Teddy Serafin wrote the screenplay, and then he got notes from the writers of the comic. And it was, oh, hey, like change the horse to a water buffalo. And it's like, well, as I'm reading the script last night, I'm like, well, this is a water buffalo in here. So this must be post notes. But once you get past the liquid silver part, the movie, it doesn't diverge completely, but it definitely goes in a very different direction. There's this whole thing when rather than them being sent out by the Rippers to find these guns, they're going out to find these suits that have what they call like cyber knives on them, and they're like the whole suit becomes basically like a knife that can kill people and like slice up people and all this. And at one point, Malcolm McDowell's character, rather than having like, he's got his hollow head, but he can basically, it feels like, move that head wherever. So he's like in one of those suits. And at one point they're testing out the suit and they put a ripper in it, and all the blades are actually on the inside, and he liquefies and becomes like complete jelly in there. And I'm like, okay, well, this is a different way to go, but it's post water buffalo. So I'm like, how much of this were we supposed to see? When did the decisions come to change this? They still had different, like there were some things that were shot in the deleted scenes. You can see there's a lot more of Subgirl, and she actually rescues them at the end. Her submarine comes up, and basically right as the movie is about to end, her sub comes up. They all get in the sub because the whole water and power thing is going to explode. She gets them out of there, and then they have a scene in the desert where it starts to rain, and they're talking about rain and
What's going on? Spitting on me. No one's spitting on you. It's rain. Oh my God, it is. It's raining. I told you so. But nobody would believe.
Oh, the rain! What a magnificent miracle of nature! It falls like tears from our crystal firmament, revitalizing the crusty earth. Oh, deep joy! Deep joy!
Yes, my pet, it is. It is raining. Nature has been restored. Soon, the earth will be reborn. Hey, wait a minute. Somebody's got to run this brave new world. Skip girl, sub girl. Places to kill. People to choose.
okay, well, that's better than this weird, like, cut to an animated sequence that just ends the movie but doesn't really wrap things up, you know? And it's not like, oh, if the ending was different, the whole movie would be better. It's just a weird and awkward way to end it. At least for me. I mean, it sounds like you guys are absolutely fine with the end of this movie, with everything in this movie almost, but
it's not a great ending. It's not a satisfying ending, right? But at the same time, this has always been one of my issues with comic books writ large, is that, like, no ending is ever really done, you know, like, oh, how many times are you going to kill Superman? How many times are you going to kill Batman? Or is coming back? Oh, and how old is Superman really? Is he from the 30s or the 40s? Or you know, it's like all these comic book rules are just different, right? So in some ways, I'm really able to let go of any feelings, because, like, what if Tank Girl had just been a big series and then there was another one and another one and another one? And by now we'd be up to Tank Girl like 11 or 12, right? You know, like if we had been given that gift, maybe we would be talking about the ending of Tank Girl like some people talk about the ending of True Detective season 1. Well, it was great until the end.
I feel like, again, if the connection with the Rippers had been a little bit more believable, that the romance to me just felt very weak, and I feel like that was a pivotal part of the ending. And I just felt like I didn't feel any chemistry, and it's just, she's such a fiery personality for most of the movie that it just felt kind of anticlimactic to have it end that way.
Yeah, and to your point, I would have liked it maybe a little bit more had she been a queer person and just her and Jet Girl go off, because to me, I would have loved to have had more Jet Girl because she's such a dynamic character in the way she comes from being so meek and mild, standing up for herself finally towards the end. I mean, she really makes a lot of changes, and she, to me, is the most interesting character in the film.
Yeah, I would have loved more of her. And also, do we know why they cut Subgirl?
Not at all. And I was trying to, when they go to the lady who has the Doris Day bust that sets Tank Girl on the quest to find Sam, the little girl, I thought she was Subgirl, but it's not. I think her name might be Sabrina or something like that, but there's a sub in it. So I was like, oh, well, that's Subgirl. And then when they showed her in the deleted scenes, I think it's a different actress.
Yeah, it's Ann Cusack is Subgirl in this.
Oh, okay. I didn't recognize her at all. I found it weird that Ann Magnuson isn't even credited in the movie.
I know.
That's so strange.
Yeah, what is that about? But also I read that Courtney Love was originally interested in playing Subgirl, or they cut the role down. And what a different movie it would have been if we'd had another strong female lead, if Jet Girl had been a bigger character. That would have been great.
I'll probably only bring up the commentary 4 or 5 more times. I'm in that commentary track. They talk about how, Courtney Love couldn't play Subgirl largely because of Kurt Cobain's suicide kind of got in the way. But Courtney did advise on the music. It cannot be overstated how important. I mean, you had the CD, I had the CD, I don't know that movie soundtracks have nearly the same power that they did then. But in a lot of cases, and this is one of them, listening to that soundtrack CD over and over again was just as good, if not better, than watching the movie sometimes.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I had this, it was like that and the Pulp Fiction soundtrack. I remember, because, this was before, obviously, Spotify. And so it was usually you just bought albums and then you would have a mixtape that a friend got you. But to have a mix that was so cool, that had been so well curated, it was like carrying a piece of the movie with you. And that was a really, really cool soundtrack.
Yeah, it's very odd to me too, trying to do a post-mortem on this film, because when Rachel brought up the whole thing of Courtney couldn't work on this because of Kurt's suicide, I was like, well, that was 11 months before the movie ended. But then as I'm watching the work print of it that's out there, the date all over that, well, they had some things from August of 94, but they had a ton of stuff from September of 94. And I'm like, okay, so you had enough of this to put together a work print by August, stuff from June of 94, and the movie doesn't come out until March of 95. I mean, this must have been a hell of a thing to put together as far as of course, I know special effects take time and everything, but by that time they had all the Ripper stuff already done. They even had temporary stuff put in place as far as some of the cartoon sequences that tie everything together. But I'm like, okay, how long before this movie came out was it actually done? Or were they, when did they start taking it away from her and tweaking things and changing things? Because it feels like they just were messing with this for months and months.
I mean, I'm sure they were messing with it, but also just almost I don't know, we can't answer this, but I'm wondering if for some, because they obviously have a schedule when it's oh, this is an ideal time to release this movie. And maybe, I don't know, maybe they were we have to wait until after the Academy Awards because we have to capitalize on that momentum for these other movies. Maybe they waited until March for some reason, even though the movie was, yes, I'm sure they worked on it behind the scenes ad nauseum, but is it possible that they were waiting for March for some other reason?
To dump it? I mean, March is a horrible time to dump movies.
Yeah.
And at this point, the Academy Awards were in March, I want to say, or closer to April.
Oh, were they? Okay.
Wasn't really capitalizing on that whole timing thing. Because I know right now, a lot of Oscar movies come out, at least in New York and LA, in December, if not before. And for me in the Midwest, it's okay, January, February becomes the time that I can see all these other Oscar-nominated films. But the new things, I mean, I mentioned Madam Web, dumped in February. And there's so many movies. Like, this is a perfect time to dump your movie. And I think that this is what this was. I think that the studio had such little faith in it that they just wanted to get rid of it. And by studio, I would say probably the head of the studio, the same guy that was just like, I don't want little girls to see this, rated R. At least that's one of the theories that goes around.
Well, as Rachel says in her commentary, it's tough when the executives don't understand your film. I know that this is an echo throughout the industry, throughout time, but it's here. And when I think about how much this film did to bring people together, we've got Catherine Hardwicke in one of her earliest front-facing roles, right? Producing, like doing all the production design on this. This film brought the Spice Girls together because 3 Spice Girls came to audition for this film. The Spice Girls arguably exist because of Tank Girl. It had Courtney Love. Sharon Stone was hanging around. That all the soundtrack. Ann Magnuson, like, could it have been done better? Absolutely. Could there have been more amazing people? Could there have been some women of color involved? For sure. I would have loved to have seen a lot of these things. I would have loved this film to be so queer, but I was there in 1995. It wasn't that easy to be queer and visible. And this was able to bring in all this queer-coded stuff and get it to fly under that radar so that you could be having your Tank Girl fan fiction and write Tank Girl and Jet Girl and Sub Girl just going and doing whatever you wanted them to do. Let's just call it the film for me, the film that launched 1,000 dreams, right?
I'm going to keep harping on the costumes, but the costumes really, just groundbreaking. And it launched, I don't know that it launched, but, Ariane Phillips was also basically an unknown. I think she had just done The Crow and then this movie. And I know that she was friends with Courtney Love. I don't know if there was any connection through this movie or not. And then it was through Courtney Love that Ariane Phillips was connected to Madonna. And then going back to the queer thing, I also kind of wonder, first of all, how much of Lori Petty's career suffered because she, quote unquote, looks gay, whatever that means. If Tank Girl had looked more like Tomb Raider, would the film have been more successful? If she wasn't such like a Butch Dyke looking character, but had been more sexualized, would the film have been more of a hit? Like how much of her queer adjacent appearance is responsible for the studios, wanting to kind of bury it and the movie not doing so well. And again, odds against it.
Yeah, it is a wonder that it even came out in any sort of form, much less holding pretty true to a lot of the things that we saw in the script. And I do have to say, too, with the final film, they do some things that they weren't doing in the script that really make a lot of sense in the finished film, which is the whole thing with the water sucker that they use to basically desiccate bodies and draw the water out of there. It's very, very Dune, right? This whole like, this water belongs to you kind of thing. But that was great. And I can't remember if it was I think it was in the screenplay. Yeah. They, like the doctor character that's consulting with him, he just straight up shoots her. And the guy who is walking across the glass, who can't get him the last 5% of the desert, I can't remember if he shoots or stabs him, but I'm just like, you're wasting all of this water. And they finally use that sucker thing on Malcolm McDowell at the very end of it, but it's just like, no, you needed to set that up. So setting it up early and using it twice and then having it used against him, I thought was very smart. There were a lot of good things that they ended up introducing to this that made so much more sense. I really like the whole thing of his, I don't know, what would you call it? Like the fortune deck that he has that also looks like knives. I thought that was very nice. And his whole poetic thing that he's doing and how, again, it's very like high culture, low culture, very much that Bugs Bunny thing. How she's just like, I don't care what you do to me, but please no more poetry. It just so reminded me of like, Bugs Bunny goes to the orchestra type of thing.
I know, it was funny because I've read a lot of the things that we're talking about, how awful the movie was and how terrible the screenplay and all that. And I was like, Lori Petty has so many great lines in that movie. I don't know, and then again, I'm not a I'm not an expert on the comics, but based on what I've seen, it seems like the movie's pretty true to the vibe of the comic.
I read a bunch of the comics before we recorded this, and I do have to say it does feel very in keeping with that. Like I said, it's very anarchic. You get more, though, of the tank not necessarily being sentient. I guess it is more sentient. It's like her dog. And you get that whole thing of like her whistling at the water buffalo and the water buffalo being very trained. And in the screenplay, there's a lot more of like the tank interacting with her and like shaking its the turret and to say no about something, or not. It's flashing its lights when it says yes, and just following her and being much more like a loyal servant. And then same thing with the jet. The jet girl has, at one point she's like, oh, your tank is so ill-mannered, you really need to train it better, like I trained my jet, and her jet will come when she calls it and all this. And
oh, I love that.
Yeah, it was great. It's like they have these big pets rather than these weapons of mass destruction. And I love that they're driving around in a big fucking tank. And I love the chase scene when Lori Petty's there, Tank Girl's there, cooking up hot dogs and just like,
Oh,
she's got the slingshot and all that kind of stuff. I'm just like, this is great.
So good.
No, the movie has such a goofy sense of humor. It doesn't take itself too seriously, which again, I mean, I like to view things through this sort of gender angle. And, and we've talked about, like I'm very interested in movies that fail because it's like, why did it fail? And it's so interesting because, again, there's something inherently problematic in the idea of Tank Girl being a girl, right? And so is it that, we want science fiction action movies to be more masculine and serious? And so it's like sacrilege to have quite so much camp and levity in it. Like, is that part of what turned people away? And then of course in science fiction, you're not supposed to have romance, and then there's romance, and like it's girlified. And so is that part of what kind of turned the core audience away? And then I was also reading that like during the 90s, you have a lot of the sort of male fantasy movies. And that's not just talking about, sexual fantasies, but even movies like The Godfather, which are these sort of like, like it's a fun escape for a man to go and see a movie like The Godfather because it's very masculine oriented in its interests. And I feel like the movie's very much targeted at women, or girls, females, and there are a lot of like anti-male jokes, and like that part about like the tweezers and the magnifying glass or the microscope or whatever, that's really funny. But I don't, men might have been annoyed by that. The potential audience for this movie keeps atrophying, because it's like they're alienating people that want serious sci-fi or that want, a serious action movie. And that, it's like instead you have this like silly girl, and then the girl's not sexualized. So then you're alienating another potential audience. And I don't know how different it is to watch the movie as like a straight man. And so many jokes are at your expense.
I don't mind. I'm pretty secure with all that stuff. So yeah, it wasn't really offending me about any of those things. I actually really like those jokes. Like when she pulls up with the big tank and is like feeling inadequate. It's like, yeah, hilarious. That's great. Yeah. And yeah, so much of the jokes are at the expense of these water and power guys or Malcolm McDowell's character. And it's like, yeah, it's great. Make fun of these guys as much as you want because they're all horrible. I really thought that Don Harvey does an amazing job as Sergeant Small, the guy who keeps harassing Jet Girl, and he's Keasley's man-at-arms type of guy. I thought he was great. I love how just horrified he is by the potential lesbianism of Jet Girl when Tank Girl gives her a big old smooch. Again, it's so Bugs Bunny to me. Just like, that's a good way to get him to quit harassing you.
When she needs to go and get photos of the weapons, and Jet's like, how can you do it? And she's like, they're just men, and she goes down there and she says, oh, I'm taking, making a calendar of pinups from Water and Power. And the men immediately like cannot wait to pose for her. It's hilarious.
That whole sequence. And then I love the use of the comic panels for that as well. I think that the use of the comics really works very, very smartly. I'm curious when they decided to do as much as they do, because they did have some of the comics and like placeholders in the work print. And then I noticed that they would actually just kind of, rather than cut them in and move things left and right, I'm like looking at like a timeline in my mind, right? From like After Effects or whatever. It's just like, rather than move things left and right, they would just kind of paste over those. So like you're actually missing the little bits of some of the action that's going on in the movie, which I thought was odd. But also at the same time, I'm like, well, if they already had the audio mixed and those things, maybe it just made sense to just slap it in instead. Some of them are very particular, very, like especially when she's decorating the tank and you keep going back to the comic panels and then back to her and then back to the comic panels. I thought that was great. I really thought it was very nice to keep with the comic. One of the few comic book movies to really keep with the comic and just be so direct with using panels and using panels in a way that wasn't annoying. Like, I know this might be some people's favorite films, but like the Ang Lee Hulk, where it was just like, yeah, that's a little too much. I don't need page turns in my movies. I'm okay with that, but he embraced the comic booky as well, just not in a way that I appreciated.
I think the comic panels really, really help with the pacing. One of the least interesting things to me in action movies is the action usually, because once I lose my place, I stop caring. I'm like, just cut to after the chase. Like, I'm a cut to the after the chase person. I don't, I'm like, okay, you're spending all this money and but let me know when you're done.
I'm the same.
Mostly the way I approach action films. And I appreciate that, even though I'm sure that a huge amount of that decision making was based on budget, right? We can't afford to have all of these. Like, we're not on a Michael Bay budget, right? And in some ways, I think we've got a better film for it. This is one of the things that makes me really get stuck on this idea that this film is a failure, because I understand why it would be perceived as that, especially by the director. But ultimately, this is a film that was for me and people like me, and it found me. That's just an amazing success. If I, as an artist, could do that for somebody else, right? I don't have to know it, right? I don't have to like get an email about it or a card or anything. Like, it's not about that. It's about just, I'm making work and I'm going to feel some kind of way about it at all times. But if something that I'm doing is actually impacting somebody that I think is cool in some regard and advances them as an artist or like whatever else they're doing, then that's so great. And that's the way that I would measure success, and certainly the way that I look at the success of this film.
I mean, imagine if you made a movie and 30 years later, people are still dressing like the characters in that movie. How many movies have that? That people have such an affinity for this movie that 30 years later, people are still, dressing up as the character. Like, I think, it's still like a popular Halloween costume. And obviously, I mean, I know, friends who will dress up as Tank Girl. I mean, it's become kind of part of the cultural lexicon. Like, okay, so I get it that we tend to judge a movie success based on the budget, the box office. But yeah, I mean, 30 years later, if people are still talking about your work, you did something good.
So this film is set in 2033. So that's 10 years away, which means that Tank Girl is like a late Gen Z, maybe Gen Alpha. So Tank Girl is a tween right now.
The movie was ahead of its time. And it sucks for, anybody whose career was impacted by its box office failure.
She's wearing a 40-watt club shirt in the Water and Power calendar scene. So it makes me wonder if her cool older sister was at the REM reunion gig last week and got a 40-watt club t-shirt. So it really makes me wonder, is Rebecca / Tank Girl an REM fan?
I was very surprised at just how many, because you guys mentioned the whole Courtney Love thing and that she was suggesting music, and there was wall-to-wall music in that work print. I know at one point on the audio commentary, Rachel's talking about how they had Green Day right before they blew up, And that's in there, the Welcome to Paradise or whatever that song is from Dookie. And they had When She Meets Her Tank, it's one of the Peter Gunn theme by Art of Noise. So they had this all music all through it. But then for the action scenes, they would use a temp track. And I thought it was nice they were using Danny Elfman's music from Batman for it, which really kind of fit for me, especially when you look at that statue or figure that's on the front of Tank Girl's tank. It looks so much like a Tim Burton type of thing, like one of those balloons from the big parade at the end of Batman, just that kind of whacked out art style that he likes to do. And I mean, you could spend so much time just going over her tank because of all of the things that she has going on with it. I love how, again, I keep using the word anarchic. I just love how chaotic, how anarchic that whole tank is, and that's her style. And she just lives by that style, and I love that style.
It again goes back to what might have been some people's... I mean, even though I do think that style is very, very true to the comic, maybe that kind of tongue-in-cheek, self-parody, kind of slapstick, superficial silliness is part of what people didn't want to see in a movie of that type. You know, that they wanted it to be more serious.
Who are these people?
They're that audience that goes and sees all the Marvel movies. I don't know.
They cut out stuff from the whole Cole Porter thing. I would have loved to have seen the whole thing in there.
There's more of that?
There's more of that. And there's a whole thing with Jet Girl singing. And yeah, it goes on for a while longer. It's really good. I would have loved to have had all of that in the movie. I think that's great. And again, to your point, I think some people, when suddenly there's a musical act and a huge, robust Busby Berkeley musical act in the middle of this movie, they probably tuned out. But I was like, I'm here for it. What I found really amusing was in the screenplay, sorry to keep going back to it, it was Singing in the Rain, which I thought was nice for the end of the movie because of the rain. But I'm sure that they changed that the minute that Malcolm McDowell got cast.
There is Clockwork Orange all through this as well. So that's not to be ignored. I mean, there's the bowler hat that Rebecca's wearing for a little while. Like there's that undercurrent is all through this. I mean, I just love how much this movie quotes other things, you know, and it isn't ashamed to be obvious about it, right? Like it's such an adoration of cinema too. Like I'm very verklempt about this movie right now. I love it.
No, but it is. It's such a celebration of pop culture and cinema and a good time. And it's just, you know, it's a movie that you can tell that the people who made it loved it when they were making it.
And I love this era of filmmaking. I mean, for me, this fits into, you know, we talked about Johnny Mnemonic a few months ago. It's like, maybe it's the Ice-T connection. I don't know what it is, or like all the rock stars and things that were in that versus this. And you've got that. You've got Judge Dredd, which is just, again, this candy colored nightmare type of movie. Amazing, amazing costumes in that. You've got, it even kind of reminds me of Demolition Man. Just like there's so many pieces and parts just all kind of thrown together. And yeah, I love this era of big budget or smaller budget, in this case, action sci-fi type movies that are just insane.
Did you read that Lori Petty was supposed to be in Demolition Man?
Oh, was she the Sandra Bullock character?
Yeah. And again, what I read was that she was fired because she looked too gay. And that's why they cast Sandra Bullock. But just speaking of movies of that moment, you know, what would have been if Lori Petty had been in Demolition Man?
Lori Petty was so big for just a brief amount of time. Yeah, between Point Break, League of Their Own, and then this movie. And then that seemed to be it for her for quite a while.
People will hate me for saying it, but I kind of wish that we had like gossip blogs back at that time, because I'm like, why? Like, was she like Sean Young and she was just like very difficult to work with, and so she just got put on a list? You know, then that's why she just didn't get cast more. Like, what happened to her?
Yeah, I would love to know myself.
Nothing in the commentary about it?
Not so much.
Well, especially because Lori's there on the commentary.
No, but she might have said, you know, she might have said, like, maybe there was, like, I don't know if it was because of the failure of Tank Girl. Like, I know that Rachel was saying that she basically got put in movie jail after, and I wonder if Lori Petty got put in some kind of a jail, like if the failure of the movie was blamed on her and that, like tanked her career. I don't know. Like I was just, because I feel like she does such a great job in that movie that even if the movie didn't do well, if I was a casting agent and I saw that movie, I'd be like, oh, she's got to be perfect for some other projects.
Yeah, but then you're getting to the latter half of the 90s, and that's when all the studios, all the companies really started pumping the brakes, right? You had all the beautiful random birth of alt rock or whatever in the early 90s, but by the end, right, it's really winnowed down to kind of a narrow thing. And I think the same thing is happening with Dylan in that regard. It was just like a whole lot of what the fuck for many, many years. And then they're like, okay, we need to pump the brakes on this. And I think it had to have impacted both of their careers. I don't know what the return. So like, I don't know what this movie made in the end. The money, they didn't make their money back. They didn't make their big profits off of this film, and you get punished for that.
Take it with a grain of salt, but Wikipedia has the budget at $25 million and the box office at $6 million.
That's what I read in a bunch of the articles, those same numbers.
You look at, Rachel's first mentor, John Waters, right? Like he hasn't been able to raise funds to get a film made in 20 something years, right? Finally is coming around to doing it. So even, like if you're in that mode of making a film that is really a passion project, that is like you're committing your vision and not really accepting what these external studio forces want to do to it, you're not going to get your studio deal. You're not going to get your $25 million budget again.
But do we know if John Waters has been trying to get a movie made? I don't know what, like.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and it's finally underway, as I understand it.
That's shocking that he would have problems raising money.
Well, a dirty shame didn't do what the studios wanted it to do, right?
Not even David Lynch can get money to make movies. And it's like, not, Alejandro Jodorowsky, like, how great would it be to get one more film out of him before he passes?
You think with, all the streaming platforms and stuff, that it would be easier for people like that to get deals? There
was Judge Dredd and there was Dredd. So I'm hoping there's like Tank Girl and then just Tank maybe. And it's just a gritty remake of a gritty reinterpretation of the Tank Girl story.
Well, you saw that Margot Robbie is working on it.
Oh, yeah. I'm curious how that's going to be.
Yeah. I mean, again, it could be great. Who knows? It could also never happen.
That's probably where my money's at, is that it'll never happen. But you never know. It's such a different world from where we were in 1995 with just the dearth of comic book movies back then. It was such a big deal when a comic book movie would get made because they were so rare. You mentioned The Crow. I can't remember when Blade was out, but it feels like it was around this time. Obviously, you mentioned Judge Dredd. It was much more of a rarity. Like Marvel was still very gun shy about things. You had the Batman movies that were happening, I think we were in the Joel Schumacher era, and it felt very much like these things aren't working out very well for us.
Well, this is making me wonder, because this is where I really show my lack of knowledge, is you had properties that were coming out of the comic book world, but they were like the major ones, the Marvels and the DCs, right, for a while. But it seems like this is right around the time that like all these alternative comics publishers are finally getting their films made, right? So like whatever, Fantagraphics, and I don't know all the different publishers, but it seems like this is kind of right around then, right? That these, I don't know, I don't know what the big publisher, comic book publisher terminology is, right? But
other than just lumping Marvel and DC, yeah, and then all of the other imprints that were out there.
What's one of those first alternative comics films that got made into a film? That I don't know, but it couldn't have been that much earlier than this.
Can you give me an example of what you're thinking about?
I mean, like, I don't know who owns what, but like The Crow seems like that, right? That's like
The Crow was right before.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you can go all the way back to Fritz the Cat, but I don't know if you're counting that.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
But making an animated movie out of a comic book's a lot easier than making a live action, I would think. And this is right in that era, too, of we are translating old TV properties to the films as well. And that's also just such a gamble. I mean, for every good one, you get like 5-10 bad ones. I don't think that the movie studios knew exactly what the hell was going on in the early 90s and just trying everything and being shy about really backing anything.
Imagine if they hadn't been cowards.
I just pulled up some movies from 1995 to remind myself. And that was also Strange Days, which I feel like could be a good double feature with Tank Girl. And then Dangerous Minds, which is, a totally different vibe. And Seven was 1995, and Johnny Mnemonic, and Hackers, 12 Monkeys. So we're definitely dealing with a lot of dystopia.
Yeah, and this fits right in with that. Because even though, they talk about the comet, they don't really show it, but there was a scene where it was young Rebecca, and you get to see the comet and a little bit more of where she's coming from. I'm kind of glad they cut that, though, because it really reminded me a lot of like Judgment Day, Terminator 2. But I have to say, I was very confused. I'm always very confused at the beginning of this movie because I swear it looks like the Golden Gate Bridge in that first shot. But then I'm guessing that we're supposed to be in Australia for the rest of this movie. What with the kangaroos and with Naomi Watts' accent. But everybody else doesn't have that accent.
Do they have water buffalo there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know where water buffalo are native to. Yeah, that's a really good question.
Well, it was supposed to be Australia, and they were originally going to shoot it in Australia. And then they realized that it would sort of be cost prohibitive. And I think that some of the locations in Australia would be like 10 hours apart from each other. And so, they opted to shoot it in, I guess, the Southwest instead. But I think it's supposed to be Australia. I think that's where it is in the comic.
All right, let's go ahead and take a break, and we'll be back with an interview with director Rachel Talalay right after these brief messages.
Hello, everyone. This is Malcolm McDowell. I just want to say that this is a request to listeners of the Projection Booth podcast to become patrons of the show via patreon.com, patreon.com/projection booth. That's pretty simple. I think you can do that. It's a great show, and Mike, he provides hours of great entertainment. So now it's time to give back, my little droogies. Settle down and take a listen and have a sip of the old Moloko. And then you'll be ready for a little of the old in out, real horror show. Bye-bye.
From what I understand, you were originally a math major and then you switched to filmmaking. How does that happen?
It was pretty straightforward. I came from a very academic family, and I was interested in filmmaking although it was not part of my life in any way, but it was definitely my passion through high school. But my very scientific academic parents were pushy, and I had math ability. I am mathematical. And I thought about applying to film school, but it's really basically once I got into Yale, I decided I needed to go to Yale. It was too good an opportunity. For whatever reason, at 18, way back when, I realized I had to take advantage of that opportunity. And although there was a film program there, and mostly film studies, I really also had this realization that I shouldn't use my Yale education in a very limited film studies program. I should take some classes, but I should get an education. And it turned out to be a really good choice from the standpoint of I did a lot of computer work. And this is like punch card days. This is pre-PC. And I did applied math, not theoretical math. And then the other reason that I did it was that Yale had only been taking women for about, I think, 6 or 7 years when I first started. And no less, like 4 years, 5 years, something like that. Anyway, and there had been no women math majors up until my year. And in my year, and I thought, wow, I can't let that go by. I can do this. In my year, there were 3 or 4, so it wasn't like I was the ceiling breaker. And 2 of them were so incredibly good. I was truly the dilettante. But I did major in it. I did get through, and I do think it was a problem-solving, and filmmaking is a problem-solving job.
What were some of the movies when you were growing up that really inspired you?
So I loved old Hollywood. So first of all, I was an incurable romantic, so I loved Fred Astaire movies. The Busby Berkeley number is because I love musicals, and I love dance movies. But I also loved the old British movies. I loved Dirk Bogarde. I loved The Servant, and I loved Gone with the Wind because I was romantic as well. And so I thought that it was possible. And I read all the celebrity biographies and autobiographies while I was watching all these. So I love Frank Capra and William Wyler, and very much the old classic Hollywood that inspired me in terms of more contemporary movies in the late 70s and early 80s. I loved Last Picture Show. I read this about Peter Capaldi the other day. He was talking about his obsession with Doctor Who stopped the day he discovered punk. And so my romantic high school girl obsession stopped the day I discovered punk. And then it became Clockwork Orange. And then it became the John Waters movies and cult movies. And so I really did this teenage girls shift from the way we were to Clockwork Orange, which does bring us to Tank Girl.
You grew up in Baltimore. Were you aware of the John Waters and his whole group before you actually got to meet him?
Yes, I was aware. And I had seen, just because of growing up in Baltimore and because of at university, we watched the cult movies. So I had seen Pink Flamingos and I'd seen cult things like Rocky Horror. And I was talking to John the other day about how there were certain porn films that were also embraced by academics. Deep Throat and I'm Curious Yellow, particularly the Ford had. I remember my academic parents going to see those films, and that was just talking about how different times were, and that we were in a group, and the rest of the group was a bit younger, and they all went, "What are you talking about? Your parents went to see these X-rated films." I shouldn't say porn. I think I probably should say X-rated. And John said, yes, it was quite the trendy academic thing to be aware of what these films were. And my parents could have been in Ang Lee's Ice Storm, except they didn't have key parties, but they very much came from that rather hip 60s, 70s world of academia. And so they were interested in foreign films and in trendy things. But they were scared. When I first got when I took my first job on polyester, where I was a PA, they were frightened something was going to happen to me in that group. They did not know how wonderful and honorable and amazing the Dreamland group is. They just knew him as the arrested cult filmmaker who, and polyester's R-rated mom and dad, and my dad really tried to embrace it and he took a job as an extra coming out of the porn movie theater in a raincoat. So he embraced it to be cool enough, but they were still a little bit nervous that certain things were happening, some of which were, but not, that sounds really bad, but there was definitely some intermingling of crew members within the group.
So how would you make that transition from mathematics into filmmaking? How did you get that PA gig?
So I literally sent a letter. There was an ad in the Baltimore City paper, which was like the Baltimore Village Voice, that was a casting call looking for the foot stomper and the Lulu character. And I'd sent a letter and said, "Hey, do you have any work? I can make coffee," which was not true. I had no clue how to make coffee in those days. And coffee was, my parents made instant in those days. So I'm really dating it. But I immediately learned how to lie to get a job. And So they called me and said, do you have a car? I was working at Johns Hopkins as a computer programmer at that point. And they called me and said, do you have a car? Will you work for free? And so my parents lent me their car, and I drove Divine and Edie the Egg Lady around Baltimore. I took them to rehearsals. I took Tab Hunter and Van Smith, the costume designer, to do the shopping and whatever was needed of me in terms of being a production assistant, which was not even a word that anybody knew in those days. But yes, I just got it because I worked for free. And the parents were cool enough to give me the car.
It could have probably just stopped there, like you're in your backyard, basically. But how do you go to be a PA and other things on other films?
First of all, they introduced me to New Line was one of the financiers of the film. So they went on to do another. Actually, the whole group went on to do The House on Sorority Row, a little horror film for absolutely no money. And the line producer went on that. And so then I went and said, can I come work on that? And they said, we need a script supervisor. I knew nothing. I really knew nothing. I had no idea how to be a script supervisor. Yeah, okay, fine. Because I just took script notes, but I knew nothing about what I was actually supposed to do. And then they said, if you really want to learn what this is about, why don't you come to New York and where we're editing? And so then you can learn. Then the editor was always yelling at me about, this is what you were supposed to be looking for. They weren't supposed to take it with this hand and then take it with that hand and see how this won't edit. Things like that. I went to New York, and when I was in New York, I met again with New Line, and they made the film Alone in the Dark. They were with the same line producer. They were making this film Alone in the Dark with Jack Palance and Donald Pleasance and Martin Landau.
It's a hell of a cast.
Yeah. And which Jack Shoulder, who did Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, directed. And so I went to meet, and they said, come work into our offices, and we don't have an accountant. And because you did math, we think that you should be the accountant. And of course, I knew zero about accounting. I didn't know anything about filmmaking, but I knew to show up, and I had a car. I didn't know anything in New York. I didn't know anything about accounting, and it was all hand accounting. It was all done in this massive ledger book. So I just taught myself, and that was part of that. There, I really credit Yale because it taught me, of course, you just say, yes, I can, of course I'm smart enough to figure this out. And one of the things that was most complicated was that the cast was SAG. And so the rules, it was the first time New Line had to pay any attention to union rules. And the union rules were really tough. And so suddenly if you went into 2 minutes of overtime, it was a lot of money. And I had to spend a lot of time with Bob Shea, the head of New Line, explaining all the accounting and why we were doing things. And he would go crazy about having to pay bills. It was good practice for when I later worked for Roger Corman, because these guys, they don't want to pay their bills. But Bob was appalled that you could be charged an entire day's worth for doing 2 minutes of overtime. But that's how I get to know Bob Shea. And it also meant that I really understood every element. By being the accountant, I knew where every penny was going. And so that's what forced me to understand every element of producing. So it was an incredible education.
This had to have been right around the time that the first Nightmare on Elm Street movie came out, which really, I know, helped cement New Line into what it would become.
So this was before Nightmare 1. And then I said, I can't make it in New York. It's too cold and there's not enough production. And I moved to LA and said, I'm going to do it. And one of the people I worked for in Baltimore was making a film for Roger Corman. And I introduced me to Corman, and I got a job at Corman Studios. Then New Line finally got Nightmare together and said, we're coming out to LA and we want you to be the accountant. You're the one person we know and we know is trustworthy, because I had been quite straightforward with Bob and Shea about the costs, and they hired me on Nightmare today. They said, we want you to be the accountant. And I said, I'm working at Roger Corman's now. I'm doing more production jobs. They said, okay, we'll give you an assistant production manager job and you can still do the accounts. And then that's where I started all my change, which I'll just do really quickly, which is on Nightmare 1, I was the assistant production manager. And they came back on Nightmare 2 and said, will you do the same thing? And I said, no, I'll be the production manager. They said, okay. On Nightmare 3, they said, will you do production manager? And I said, no, I want to live produce. So they said, okay. Then when Nightmare 3 was very successful, they said, come work within the company and we want you to produce films for us. So then I produced Nightmare 4. And that's what led me to produce Hairspray with them. And that's how I made that weird leap from being a PA with John Waters on Polyester to coming back and being his producer on his next film. That's a weird leap. And I didn't let New Line say, John, you have to have Rachel. I called him up and said, New Line wants to put a producer on the film. They're suggesting me with the Baltimore and with my connections with you. How do you feel about it? Because I was a PA last time with your whole group. And he said, it has to be you. And I understood that to mean you understand the group. They can't send some Hollywood type who won't understand Baltimore, who won't understand the group, who won't respect us. So I went in with huge respect for the whole group and fought for the whole group as best I could. And then after I did Nightmare 4 and Crybaby, Bob Shea directed his first film, Book of Love. And after that, I said, I want to direct Nightmare 6. And I had to go in and pitch a whole idea, and they gave me that opportunity. So that's my meteoric rise in the 80s.
So I was actually working at a movie theater when your Nightmare movie came out. And it was fantastic, but also at the same time, people were so confused. You made it so easy for them to know when to put on their 3D glasses. You would not believe the number of complaints that I got in the lobby of people coming out going, the film's so blurry.
No, we couldn't afford to do the whole film in 3D. And all this was a marketing ploy, right? We couldn't afford to do the whole film in 3D. We needed the beginning like Polyester, that where you learn, where they said, don't put on the 3D glasses until she puts on the 3D glasses. But it being Nightmare, we didn't do that. Yeah, people were confused and said, and of course it was much darker watching it like that. And then they, three-quarters of the way through the movie, they, oh, oops. People tell me recently, Nightmare, Freddy's Dead is a complicated, a lot of people really hate it. But people told me recently how well they think the 3D works, which is shocking to me because it doesn't work really well at all. To me, it's this expensive, exhausting disaster. But I've had people say, you're just being way too hard on yourself. And actually, the video-wise, you can get quite an effective 3D. So it's good to hear when people say nice things when you've been spending 30x years thinking you failed.
It was a great gimmick, but I love gimmicks. I'm a big William Castle fan, so that whole thing of put him on now, great. This is terrific.
And that was the point. They'd done 4 Nightmare films in 4 years, so it was really important to do something different with parts with mine. And one of the big things was to call it Freddy's Dead rather than Nightmare on Elm Street Part 6, so that people did get the feeling that it was possible that this might be the last one. Not that anybody really believed it, but at least it gave it a boost. And then you had 3D as well. So all those gimmicks were important and very New Line.
I was really impressed with Ghost in the Machine as well. It was one of those first early cyber thrillers almost. It beat a lot of the other ones to the market.
That's a complicated one as well. Fox greenlit it, and then the heads of the company changed hands, and the new head didn't want horror films. The new heads, their mandate was family films. And so we were caught in that little time period where we were already greenlit. We were already basically going ahead, and we were a bastard child, what I call a bastard child film. So it never really got the love that because it needs some work, but it's got some good stuff in it. The microwave scene is a good scene, and it's also wonderfully dated. The babysitter scene is so inappropriate and dated, but it has a lot of the things that I learned from Nightmare in it, but it didn't quite skew up enough for the teen audience. I liked the crash test dummy scene as well, but I would say that as with Nightmare, and potentially with Tank Girl, endings are not my strong point. There's a tendency to run out of money and then the ending goes plot.
I've heard the story about, was it your daughter that turned you on to Tank Girl?
My stepdaughter gave it to me as a Christmas present.
How do you go from that to putting a package together for that?
It's hard. It took 2 years. So I said, Punk Rachel, absolutely the best possible comic book I could ever imagine. Complete maverick out there, fuck the patriarchy. So I went and I just basically wrote to the publisher and said, I'd really like to do this and this is who I am. And then a year of back and forth, and we have other interest and we have this, and just complete insecurity on his part because it wasn't independent about how to handle this. And finally I just said, okay, I give up. I don't mean enough. I'm not strong enough. I'll never convince them. Because what I'm basically offering is that I'm an honorable person and you're not going to find, and I really love this project. I'm going to do everything to involve the comic book guys and you, and we're going to do this together. I'm going to do everything I can, but I can't offer you a huge deal and I can't offer you. And ultimately, I just went to the place where I said, where I was ready to give up. So I said, do you want to get a lawyer involved or something and have one more conversation? And they did. And they chose this Hollywood lawyer who is a wonderful guy and is still my lawyer now, who was also at Yale graduated the year before I graduated, a wonderful man. And he came in and he basically brokered the deal and helped them not feel insecure about going with me. And they made the decision. I don't know what their other offers were or what the other situation was, but they made the decision that my passion and my sort of argument toward honorability was worth going with. So after about probably a year and a half, I got the option. And the option was basically just to pitch it. And I said, I don't think there's not enough plot to the comic book. You're not going to be able to write it, but you're certainly going to be able to influence and be involved in the visuals. But we're going to have to bring a writer on board. So I went out and pitched it, and bizarrely, I had nothing. Now you have to basically, in order to pitch something and get it made, you have to basically make the movie for them to show them. But I didn't even have any, I just had the comic book and me. And I went in and did these pitches without a plot, saying, we're going to get a writer. This is the type of movie we're going to make. And I ended up with 4 offers. And we made the decision to go, the best of the offers financially and the most was United Artists. And at that point, it was run by Alan Ladd. And he seemed to be very filmmaker friendly and he seemed to really get it. And then, so we took this deal knowing that it was dangerous to be with a studio. And then with my particularly special good luck, the head of the studio changed hands when we were at the green light phase. And the studio was taken over by someone who could not, if you scoured the universe for the least appropriate person to do Tank Girl, it was him. And everything was downhill from there.
How did Teddy Sarafian, how did he get involved in this?
I took it to Trilogy, who was having a very successful time period, who I'd worked with in my independent days. And they weren't particularly the right people for it, but they had the relationship with United Artists and they had just made Robin Hood and Blown Away. And so they had a lot of influence and they said, we're really going to help protect you. And it's really good for us to have this feminist, this really out there different type of project because we've done everything that's so conventional. But they didn't really get it. But I was like, it's going to be fine because it's my passion. It's mine. It's mine. And nobody's going to fuck with me. Idiot. And I'm going to break the glass ceiling and I'm going to show everybody the idiot. I'm going to show that Hollywood isn't everything that it is. So I really had this I believe in this and there's a punk time. So their development person helped me meet with a variety of writers. And Teddy came in. He was at that point had a project with Spielberg that was very original and it never got made. That was very original and interesting. And he had the sort of, for us, the best take that was, I knew that we had to compromise to do a solid plot, which in order to be able to make Tank Girl within that. So we had to have a certain degree of a classic action plot. And if you watch the movie, it doesn't feel like it's there, but it doesn't fully feel like that. And that's because they ripped the movie apart. His script had more solid action, but I didn't care about that. I didn't care about any of that. And when I screen the movie now, I say to people, the thing that I would do now differently is have no plot. I would just have it all chaos, and there's too much. There's preaching of the boyfriend at the beginning, and even though the setup for that is good, you don't need that for her to be Tank Girl. She's Tank Girl. Why do we have to have this bullshit? And boy, do I have a folder of notes this big from them, script notes, and they always start with what's the inciting incident? What turned her into Tank Girl? And I said she didn't have to be raped by her father to have turned into Tank Girl. And so then I say, we all have, whether we're introverted or extroverted, all women have Tank Girl within them. And that's what makes the movie so important and means so much to the people who get it. Because it's a movie you either get or you don't get. Teddy seemed to be able to give us the plot. And what Teddy needed to be was influenced to make it Tank Girl. So there's the early drafts where there's original cool plot ideas. And then there's 1,000 notes from us saying, no, she can't come riding in a horse. She needs to come riding in a water buffalo. No, she needs to swear like a British. There's 3 pages of notes from Jamie and Alan, Jamie Hewlett and Alan Morton, the comic book creators, of just British swear words that I still don't, are just shocking. How many words there are for vagina and penis. It's incredible how many words they found for. And so loosening Teddy up while keeping the structure there so that the studio would say, yes, there's an action film we want to make and we're going to greenlight this. And it was such a tightrope. And Teddy he embraced it. The rest of the crew were all full on Tank Girl. Like they couldn't believe how lucky, and half couldn't believe how lucky they were that this original film was getting made and that we could really go out there and make something this original and this punk and this out there and with this much attitude. But Teddy had to walk with Chris Rare, who was the development exec at Trilogy, and I had to walk this line where we say, there's still an action picture in here, and we're just going to keep making it crazier.
Tell me about how you assembled your crew, because you've talked before about the costume designer, your production designer. These are all just top talents that we're seeing on screen.
They weren't top talents. They weren't. We have really proved that we made incredible selections. Catherine Hardwicke wasn't even in the union, I think, or maybe Ariana Phillips. One of them wasn't even in the union. And Trilogy had been working with the Academy Award winning and these huge names on their big films. And they wanted me to go out and meet these big names. And I, who came from this indie world, wanted the passionate indies. It was probably the most apparent was when we went to meet production designers, because the production designers they sent to me all said, hey, what do you want? Until Catherine came in. And Catherine brought a truckload of ideas. And I wonder if the experienced production designers, because I knew what I brought to the table. I wanted to know what they brought to the table. And I wonder if they had been beaten into being told they were wrong and losing jobs, and therefore just what? Because they would just say, yeah, I can do that. Yeah, I can do that. Instead of, wow, this is amazing. This is original. I can't wait to try this. What about this? They were all felt very constrained. And then Catherine came in with so many ideas. And it was so brilliant. It was so clear that I was just looking for people who got it with a capital G. And she got it. Catherine has directed wonderful films since then, but she has in her office, she has a cabinet for each of her films. And then she has a cabinet for Tank Girl, because she still feels like it's that film that she's still proud of from her production design days, because it was so different and so original. And she says people still, and interestingly, I ran into Ariana Phillips, who had done The Crow, but almost nothing else. when she came to interview. And we chose her because interesting costume designers were coming in, and they'd come in with tear sheets of ideas. So at least they came in with ideas. But often their tear sheets were Ariana's actual work. So when she came in, even though she didn't present as this sort of Hollywood type, when she came in, I was like, we can have the person who did the original work, or we can have the people who want her work. And again, totally passionate about the idea. But interestingly, I saw her the other day at John Waters has a massive exhibit at the Academy Museum, which is incredible. Everybody should go to LA and see his exhibit if they can. And she was at the opening of that. And so that was a great reunion. But she said, I have never decided, and she's worked with Tarantino, and she said 4 Academy Award nominations. I think it's 4. You can fact check me, correct me. So it might be 3, but she's had a bunch of Academy Award nominations. She's worked with Tarantino. She's a phenomenally successful production designer. And she said, I designed more and built more costumes on Tank Girl than any other show I ever did. And that was like, wow, yeah, that was a different time. And she said, I miss that. I miss being allowed to be that creative. And that makes me really happy. They're all proud of the film, which is cool. But Trilogy was like, why do you want the person with no experience? Why do you want Catherine who's not in the union? They were like yelling at me for not going with their super experienced people. And I'm trying to say, I'm going with the people who are right for this film, which ultimately I won. And then they said, we're insisting on one thing only, and that's you're going to have Stan Winston. And you're supposed to say, oh, thank you. And I was like, Stan's been directing. He probably wants to, my insecurity was he probably was thinking about how he's going to get to take over the project and get to direct it. And I've worked with all these makeup effects people on all the nightmares. I've worked with a wide variety of people who've come from nowhere and become very big. Why do I need Stanton Winston? And boy, was I wrong on every level. So I'm the first person to admit Stan was wonderful. The work was brilliant. It was a whole nother 5,000 layers above anything that I'd ever seen or imagined. But also he was absolutely wonderful. He loved the project. He was funneling money from other projects so they could spend more on it because we didn't have enough to do it properly. And all the guys who are still around still talk about it as one of their favorite because we opened the door to massive creativity.
And those kangaroo costumes are just amazing to see all the articulations and that they're always moving. That you never see a dead shot of one of those actors.
Each kangaroo man had 4 people who took care of them. So if you had all 8 of them, or maybe it was 3, but if you had all 8 of them in a scene, you had 20 to 40 subsidiary people who had to be able to see them and run the motion. It was so hard. And it was 1,000 degrees where we shot. So it was a really hard shoot, but the results are bizarre and great.
This might be a silly question, but I have to ask it. You mentioned The Crow. I remember, obviously, Superman had come out in 78. I want to say Judge Dredd was coming out right around the same time. But comic movies weren't the same as they are now, obviously. Was there any sort of hesitation about putting together a comic book film, or was that okay?
Hesitation from me or hesitation from the studio?
From the studio.
I wasn't party to that discussion. Yes, it wasn't like today where and now we're skewing a little bit to the negative about that, but the period of time where for 15 years you could sell anything. I think that when Alan Ladd said yes, he purely saw it for what it was. This is Alan Ladd Jr. He purely saw it as this very original feminist, or maybe not girl power, but very out there punky action film. And nobody said to me, women action doesn't sell. Nobody in MGMUA said that. They said it to me in other places. Or when I pitched it to Jim Cameron's company and they said, we already have a film with a female lead. And I was like, my very first pitch. And I'm like, Jim Cameron's company is saying we already have this is like the man who made female leads work, female action leads work. What do you think? So I was so nervous and nonplussed. I said, what is it? And they said, Joan of Arc. And, okay, I can see where you can't make Tank Girl because you're making Joan of Arc.
Apples and apples, yeah.
There were some great stories about these pitches. But no, I don't remember that much discussion of the sort of, I was just like, this is going to be a great movie. And I wasn't worried about what you would have to now, which is not only would you have to pitch what the marketing would be, and you'd have to pitch comparables and how much money they've made, which is a problem until Barbie. Thank God for Barbie. And our box office made it so that no women comic book movies were made until Wonder Woman. Or I'm exaggerating. So that when the literal people listen to this, they come back and go and make a list of everything that was made. I do understand that I'm exaggerating, but none were successful until Wonder Woman.
When did things start to sour for you? Was it pretty good on set? Was everything good with the shooting and everything? When did you start to feel that there were other forces at work?
When the studio changed hands, the new head was very busy. So we became the bastard child, as I said. And so there wasn't as much. I had meetings with him that were weird and that it was clear he didn't understand. And he was an oddball in these meetings. But he didn't really interrupt until we started falling behind in the schedule. And then they started getting heavy and saying, you're doing too many ad libs. And it started to become clear that there was a degree to which he was offended by Laurie's ad libs. And I was letting her just add the sexual innuendo everywhere and he was finding that difficult. And he was saying, no, I want more action. But I didn't take it to we had a very good day-to-day executive who was saying, it's fine. Just get the budget under control. And we're fine. They started cutting things, but that was reasonable because we did fall, we're not talking Istar behind. We're talking a few days because it was so unbelievably hard in the desert, in the heat. People were sick. There were numerous reasons why we fell on a 94-day schedule that we fell a couple of days behind. So a couple of things were cut. No, it wasn't. Nothing really was alarming. And then we got to the edit. And then the first time they saw it, it was just, that's where it completely went wrong. And he just hated it. And then it just became this battle of, they're going to recut it. They're going to do this. It's a disaster. And it was a nonstop battle from then on. They tried to fire me. They brought their marketing person in who really wanted to get a directing credit on it and did a bunch of marketing things and then put his shot, it said, I'll re-edit it and put his own shots into the movie. And I said, you can't do that. The Directors Guild protects me. And they said, if you talk to the Directors Guild about it, we'll fire you. This lawyer said, just stay in there, fight your corner, and try and keep as much as you can of the stuff that you care about. And there were different people who came in and helped me fix things that they had really messed up. So Teddy came in and asked them not to change certain things that they changed. And he said, this messes up my storyline. The music supervisor, Bonnie Greenberg, came in and said, you can't cut in the middle of lyrics, in the middle of let's do it. Because they had just said, okay, we'll just cut half this lyric out. Because shockingly, we made up new lyrics to Cole Porter, which is incredible given that we got permission to write new lyrics for Cole Porter. I've been told since then that Cole Porter's estate is very difficult, but we got permission and wrote new lyrics. But they cut in the middle of bars and musical bars. They didn't want to hear from me. And at one point, we got some visual effects in that were terrible, like completely barely talking about blurry, dark and blurry and terrible. And I sent them back, and the producer came storming in and yelled at me and said, you can't send that. You have no right. You can't send that back. You have no say. Only we can. You've been sidelined. And I said, okay, you put it in the movie then. And so the editor put it up, and Vintage, they have delivered this, but not until after I've been completely had the floor wiped with me.
What was your vision of the film? I mean, I've seen a rough cut of it that's out there. Looks pretty terrible because it looks like many generations of VHS. That definitely has more things than what I saw in the theatrical version. But what was your overall vision for it?
It's not that it's a completely different film because the film's there, but it did push the envelope further. And the plot made more sense. And it was more fun. It was more out there. But I can now watch the film however many years later. How many years later? Are we nearly 30? Getting on for 30? I can now go to screenings of the film and I only cringe in two places. That's either getting old or getting used to it. But yeah, I don't cry over changes except in two specific places. And I look at it and I think, I wish I'd been a better director. I could have done more with it. Part of my vision would also be that I could have done a better job. But I now have this massive appreciation for how important a film it is. And that I think it's really important for people to see how incredible it was that the Naomi Watts character is the definition of Me Too. How in 1995, we didn't think, oh, we're going to represent Me Too. That's just every woman I knew had been through that. And so she had been harassed by a guy in a power position. That was just standard operating procedure. So we were showing that. And then the satisfaction when she blows him away. Naomi did an incredible job going from that shy. Her transformation, I think she's terrific in it. And I think that when people talk about the whole story and they love it to say what a disaster it was, I correct people that it wasn't necessary. It didn't get terrible reviews at all. It just didn't do business. But there were lots of people there were some really wonderful reviews. It wasn't universally panned and universally hated, but it was not appreciated. And then people found it. And I'll talk to people all the time because I went to a sold-out screening the other day and people were in full cosplay and screaming all the lines. And it's wonderful to have the sort of a Rocky Horror to realize that it did work. Because at the same time, I'd rather have Tank Girl than Judge Dredd because nobody remembers Judge Dredd. I wanted a movie that you loved or you hated. I got a movie that you love or you hate. You get or you don't get. I did accomplish that. I just got I had the floor wiped with me on the way.
I have to ask about those two moments that make you cringe. What are they?
When she's building the tank, there's footage that was shot by the marketing guy. And I'm just like, so I look at that and I just, fuck you. It's not like the footage is so terrible. Laurie made it better, but I just can't bear that he got footage in it. And I really miss a more satisfying ending with Subgirl. We had much more interesting material in the script, a lot of which we couldn't afford to do. And so around the ending, there's stuff that just it goes flat. I don't miss, we had a different ending where it rained. We didn't have an animated ending. We added the animation at their request, but we had no problem because we had the animation in the middle anyway. The third place that makes me cringe is when we did add later the comic book panels that Jamie drew and the one where Malcolm does the Wicked Witch of the West on melting. Because I had done that Wizard of Oz joke in Freddy, it just felt so on the nose. And they insisted on that one. And I absolutely would not have that joke in there if I didn't have to. So those are a couple of things. The cold room scene, I don't cringe at this, but the cold room scene was much longer and more painful. And it was a much stronger scene. And in the test screenings, it was one of the most liked scenes. When it was in its long form, they cut it back because the executive said, she looks so ugly. I can't look at her. I think we should cut the whole scene out. So we made this compromise. I'm like, here I am thinking, Laurie's amazing. We made this compromise that made it a half-ass, not as powerful a scene. And then nobody said it was their favorite scene. So I went to see the executive and said, hey, here's the numbers. And he went, I don't care. He didn't say I didn't care. He just shrugged and said, keep it the way I insist. Okay, if you're not going to pay attention to the audience, you're not going to, then this is where I stand. And I soon learned, later on, I learned how much he was so old-fashioned and so old school that he couldn't stand any of the feminists, any of the powerful women messages to do with it. He was delighted. He insisted on the R rating because he felt that young girls shouldn't see it. Because I ask, if I do screenings now, I'll ask, why is it rated R? There's some sexual innuendo, but there's EVA, which has a PG-13. It's so much more shocking than Tank Girl. So why is it? And it's not the violence. So why is it rated R? It's rated R because he didn't want young girls to see it because he thought it would corrupt them. That's the theory. Lori Petty's absolutely 100% insistent that that's the case.
I know she wasn't originally cast as Tank Girl, but my God, she is just amazing.
She is Tank Girl. She fully 100 zillion times embraced and loves it. And still, I think it's probably more part of her, even though she's more respected for other roles. We compare notes about our career, how proud of it we are, and how much it screwed our careers.
Now, did you go to the infamous movie jail after the film, or did you get to bounce back?
No, I went to movie jail for 25 years. I've made one feature film since then, 3 years ago, and only for kids' movie for Netflix. That's it. I could not get out of movie jail for the life of me. So fortunately, television embraced me. I went to the UK. I got to make wonderful projects, particularly in television projects, particularly in the UK. Women couldn't get work anyway in the 2000s. I call 1998 to 2014 the dark years. 4% of features were made by women during that time. So it was impossible anyway. So when things started to change, and then I was lucky that I have a British passport and I can work in the UK because I got to work at wonderful projects, and then I got ultimately what I really wanted, which was to work on Doctor Who. And that's worked out very well for me in terms of a very satisfying world to be in.
You have worked on so many amazing shows, and it's to me, that's the silver lining, is that you were able to go into television, and TV wasn't the premier thing that it is now, but it has been the premier thing for, gosh, since kind of the late 90s with like things like The Sopranos and things. And you've worked on some amazing shows.
But I couldn't get on I did in the 90s and early 2000s. I did Ally McBeal, which was great, but I couldn't get HBO. Well, I still can't get HBO. I still haven't done a pilot. Still an incredible battle, although I have been able to work on some absolutely wonderful projects.
So what are you working on right now?
Like everyone, was very hurt by the strike. And so last year was empty. And so it's only heating up now. And I have a really wonderful offer for the end of the year that I'm not allowed to talk about because they haven't announced it yet. And in the meantime, I'm looking to see what I can fill in, if I can get something great before then. But I am excited to say that I have something I'm really thrilled about in the second half of the year.
That's great. I wish you luck with that, and I'll definitely keep my eyes peeled for that one.
Thank you.
Did I read right that you were doing some teaching as well?
I did teach for about 7 years during the dark period. There was when I'd started doing Doctor Who, but it became impossible to be in two places at once. And things were getting better and better. I really loved teaching. I loved students. But I didn't want to give up. Things were finally getting great. And so I wasn't going to give up Sherlock to teach because I got to do Sherlock. I got to do American Gods. And I got to do some wonderful Doctor Who episodes. But yes, and now I do talks and lectures and conventions. And I'm incredibly lucky because when you go and somebody will say, have I heard of anything you've made? And I'll say, what genre interests you? Because who knew that Nightmare on Elm Street would be in the zeitgeist? Who knew that Hairspray would find its way into this Broadway musical that made it an everyday? And who knew that Doctor Who would be bought by Disney Plus last year? And so now all of Doctor Who is available in the US. So I've been lucky that I can talk about, and then people will get excited about the Berlanti shows, or you'll be really surprised that they'll get excited about things and Tank Girl. Who knew that this year I'm doing another screening of it in Edmonton in March, and they're just thrilled that they can do a special event with it. I would happily four-wall it around the country and let people see what an important movie it is and how unusual it is. And sometimes I now can talk about it in comparison to Barbie, because I feel that Greta Gerwig had to still be meta. The plot isn't feminist and kick-ass like we were. It's the meta portion of the plot, which is brilliant and so clever, and I loved it. But she, in a weird way, she couldn't make the Barbie plot that. She had to go at it in this meta way. And maybe had to is the wrong word. Maybe she chose to, and that worked for her. But it's brilliant. Its success is just the greatest thing ever. But still, I looked at that and I thought, if Barbie had told the Tank Girl story, would that have been too scary?
I'm really glad that you were able to make this film, though it's compromised, but I'm glad you're able now to watch it and not cringe too much. But yeah, it was such an important film, and I'm so glad that, because I think because of things like Tank Girl, there are Barbies now and other films that have been made, because yeah, it was a landmark movie.
Just yesterday, somebody said on one of my social media, there is no patriarchy anymore. And yeah, and this big argument, and then I just deleted it because I'm like, yeah, I don't want that in I've tried really hard to keep my social media just, they know who I am, but how can you possibly say that there's no patriarchy? Let me tell you, there's still a patriarchy.
What world is that person living in? Because I wouldn't mind living there if there is no patriarchy anymore. Jeez.
Exactly. Did you know whose thread you're on that you're saying this? Obviously not. I didn't make up how hard it was just to be a woman and to get work. And now people are very vocal about the fact that many men had box office failures and got many more movie opportunities, and didn't go to movie jail for 25 years. It is what it is. It's my life.
Ms. Talalay, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate this.
I hope it was helpful. Thanks, Mike.
All right, we are back, and we are talking about Tank Girl. And I know I've mentioned that script and deleted scenes a bunch. There are some things in the deleted scenes, and I don't know if the deleted scenes are on this new Blu-ray that's coming out. I really hope that they are, because throughout the years with Shout Factory and some of the other companies that have owned this, they've actually put out some pretty decent releases of this. There's just some things that still look like they're being taken right off of VHS. And I don't know if there's any way that they could get a cleaner copy of that work print that's floating around, but that would be nice as a comparison as well, because there's some interesting things in there. It really holds to so much of the movie, but like I said, there's alternate, and they probably wouldn't release this because of that, alternate music cues. There's a couple like scenes that are extended for a little bit longer. There's one part of the deleted scenes that I know is also in the script, which is, it's a total dick move and really makes me hate Malcolm McDowell more than anything else that he does in the movie. He can go ahead and kill his own people, kill the doctors, whatever it is, but he serves Tank Girl a meal of her water buffalo, and that's what makes me disgusted more than anything else.
Oh, I'm so glad that wasn't in the movie.
Yeah, because she's like, oh, this steak is pretty tough. And he's like, well, you should have fed your water buffalo a little better then. And it was like, oh. And she is very upset about that, which I'm glad for her. She really cared about that.
That would have been really sad. I'm glad that the movie avoided any real pathos.
Yeah, that would have been a little too real in this Fantasia, this anarchic Fantasia.
It already gets pretty real when it comes to Iggy Pop almost raping a little girl.
Yeah, well.
But I'm glad it gets his just desserts.
Even though it's disturbing, it's still treated with the kind of levity, and it's like, the girl kind of fights back and shows him, and so it's kind of in good spirits. Whereas if she'd been eating her own pet, that would have been messed up.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was very nice to see Iggy Pop, kind of like seeing Anne Magnuson as the madam in that club. I think that the club sequence might be one of my favorite things about this movie, just because it's so elaborate, and I love a good musical sequence.
Yeah, me too.
Totally off the wall, which is also one of the things that's so great about the movie, is it just keeps you guessing.
And Sergeant Small hears the music, and he's like, what is that? And the guy behind him, I think it's Cole Porter, sir.
I mean, that's what I'm saying. When I was reading about people trashing the screenplay, and I was like, there are really good lines in that screenplay.
No, there definitely are. A lot of that is in that original screenplay, and then I know that Lori Petty even ad-libbed a bunch of stuff as well, and I thought she did a great job.
She does a perfect job.
I love when she's in the dressing room and it's all sped up, and the way that she's kind of zipping around and trying on the different outfits and coming towards the camera. That whole sequence is fantastic.
I can't imagine any other actress having done that. Like, just really embodying the role in that way.
No, and I love the whole story too, how they had another actress cast and Lori Petty's just like, no, I'm still going to be her. Like the way that she believed her way into the role almost, because she is freaking perfect.
I read that the original actress didn't want to shave her head, and so that's why they ended up going with Lori Petty.
And I don't think Lori Petty had any problem whatsoever.
No, she was made for that role.
Give me a 3-hour cut. 3 hours.
Stranger things have happened, and it would be way better than the Snyder cut of Justice League. So I'm all for it. Come on, HBO. Do some good. Forget the Ayer cut of Suicide Squad or The Suicide Squad, whichever the name is. But yeah, give us Tank Girl, the ultimate director's edition.
Absolutely.
Couple $1 billion to clean up some of the effects. Maybe give us that ending that we want, and then give us a sequel while you're at it.
The prosthetic penis.
Prosthetic penis. As a lesbian, I want to see that prosthetic penis.
I can't believe that they were so shy of the quote unquote bestiality of the movie.
Also, I read that Tank Girl's room originally had all these dildos in it, and then the studio exec was horrified and was like, gotta get rid of those. I mean, and it still got an R rating, so that's what just to me is so mind-boggling. Like, it doesn't have any racy content, and it still got an R rating.
As Lori Petty said in that commentary track, if I had known it was getting an R rating, I would have been nude in this whole movie.
I mean, yeah, why not live a little? I was just shocked because I couldn't remember what it had been rated, and I went and I looked, and I was like, wait, what?
We think that we've come a long way, and we have in some regards, but come on. This is, what'd you say, 30 years ago, and it was just so threatening to male executives that this woman had dildos in her room.
Yeah, that it had to be removed. And they had to reshoot it because they didn't have the technology to just blur it out. So they had to reshoot it. I mean, it's just crazy. Like, who knows how much money that cost?
All right, let's go ahead and take another break and play a preview for next week's show right after these brief messages.
wasn't a dream.
There's a group that meets.
Group?
People who've seen the same sort of things you have.
Which group of aliens abducted you?
Bob, we are not victims. We are participants.
I don't recall them being human.
I've got to go! My baby's screaming!
You people, you sit there, you're in for one big surprise.
That's right, we'll be back next week with the alien abduction film Communion. Until then, I want to thank this week's co-hosts, Dahlia and Rahne. So, Rahne, what is the latest with you?
Well, I'm about to launch into the podcast world myself, this time for my work. I've got a job working for Johns Hopkins University Press, and we do a podcast where we interview journal authors about their cool research. So I'm a couple of months away from putting that onto the podcast airwaves.
That sounds so exciting. You'll let us know?
Yes, absolutely. Coming up April to May, somewhere in that cusp area.
I feel like I gave the same answer to you when we did the Johnny Mnemonic thing, but because I'm still working on the damn essay, but I've been working on this essay about the Black Dahlia since the summer. And it's like, I somehow, thought it would be this sort of, I don't know. I guess I thought it would come together faster. It's on the home stretch. I think I'm probably on, I've gotten like my third round of edits or something. It's for an anthology about true crime. But it has been, and I realize it because it's sort of unlike anything I've ever written, because I'm not necessarily, I'm not talking about specific movies. I'm just talking about the way that this woman's life has kind of been repurposed in popular culture. And it's been, really separated from any kind of, like, her humanity's been completely stripped out of it. Like, nobody cares about Elizabeth Short and Elizabeth Short's life. It's all about, the Black Dahlia after death, and sort of how that really kind of set the precedent for how we would appreciate true crime in this day and age. So it's kind of a weird thesis. And so I think that's kind of why it's taken me so long. But yeah, here we are, February. Still haven't finished it, but almost done.
Well, I look forward to reading it when it's available.
I cannot wait to share it with you and get your thoughts. I should probably actually do that before I submit the final draft, because you might have some good ideas, because you're usually good at that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the compliment.
I love your feedback.
Well, thank you so much, ladies, for being on the show. Thanks to everybody for listening. If you want to hear more of me shooting off my mouth, check out some of the other shows that I work on. They are all available at weirdingwaymedia.com. Thanks especially to our Patreon community. If you want to join the community, visit patreon.com/projection booth. Every donation we get helps the projection booth take over the world.